Great. So welcome, everyone. Structure 1515. We are now on Series 2, and this is the Balance Basics series. Today we're doing Session 9, which is on creating critical mass in international partnership programs. And again, I give myself 15 to present, and then we have at least 15 to talk and share some reflections and experiences. So with that, I'm just going to go straight in, and we'll just run through some slides, a couple of introductory slides, and then the specific topic, and then we can revert back to the full floor. So this series, I'm starting with my books instead of finishing with my books, just to point out that a lot of the content of the Structure 1515 is taken from my two books, the Primer for Partners that came out a couple of years ago, and the Book for Builders, which came out earlier this year. They are complementary kind of companion books, and they're available on Amazon. So if you like what we're doing here, if you're into the topic, then I encourage you to look at the books because there's much more in there. And I also like to say that, the overarching thing that we're trying to do here is basically identify where we are in the landscape. So I guess I'm just a firm believer that if you can see the landscape and if you can see yourself in the landscape, then as partners, you can see much more what the options are and make better choices. So specifically, here we are in the international arena, and we are talking about specifically international partnership programs. And many of you have seen this before, but I'll just do a quick definitional. International partnership programs, it's a term that a lot of people use, but they don't necessarily know exactly what they're talking about. So I've tried to give it some definition. And my definition combines the old and the new. So what we're talking about is really, in international space, a hybrid between a new partnership element through a governing body and support through an existing and old, robust, mature organization, like an international organization, maybe the World Bank, maybe a UN agency, maybe the UN MPTFO. And then, of course, the reality is, particularly having mentioned the MPTFO, these partnerships usually need funding. So we very typically have these three components: existing supporting entity with new partnership elements like a governing body and a trust fund. And there are many examples of this. We won't dwell on it too much because I do want to go into the topic itself. And last month we did Finding the Sweet Spot, and today we're going to talk about creating critical mass. And as you can see from that little vignette to the side, that's me building the cover shot for my book for builders. And it's really just to say that finding the balance is not always the easiest. It could take some effort. So let's plunge in. What do we mean by critical mass? Critical mass, I guess many of you may have come across this phrase in the context of nuclear physics, where it's the minimum amount of fissile material that's needed to cause a chain reaction that continues without stopping, basically an explosion, like an atomic bomb. And that is not what we are referring to today. We are not trying to explode anything here. To the contrary, but I think we can hold on to the more general concept, which is that critical mass is the amount you need to make something happen. And in the context of partnering, I'm going to give you two images. One is that you can say, for example, that it's the amount of glue that you need to make the partnership cohere, to kind of make the center hold. Maybe think secretariat. But you could also say it's the amount of ballast, just for another image, that will make the partnership stay afloat. So you've got that water in the tank at the bottom, and there might be some waves, there might be some wind, but you're going to be able to manage all of the weather and keep it going. So in essence, if you're looking at critical mass, that's that critical mass. If you don't have it, you won't have the chain reaction. And in partnership terms, that means you probably won't have the synergies that you're looking for, and you won't have the sustainability that you need. And since we know that partnering is all about creating a whole that's more than the sum of the parts, if you don't get synergy or sustainability, then kind of like, what's the point? We might as well do it ourselves separately, individually. So getting that critical mass is a really important threshold factor in being able to build the synergy and sustainability of an international partnership. And I'm not done with the physics lesson, so I also want to introduce this notion of centripetal force. This goes a little bit beyond what's in my book, but it's, I think, helpful to think of the two together. And if you've ever played tetherball, you know that centripetal force is the force that's pulling towards the center. So here are three partnership things to think about in that context. One is that you're not going to be able to pull towards the center unless you actually have a center. So, think critical mass. Also, this pull is through something that will keep it in, like in this case for tetherball, the string. What is going to make that force? And I'm sure people who do physics, if you're knowledgeable in physics, I'm surely mangling these concepts, so bear with me as I just use it for illustrative purposes. But you can think of this string as being what we talked about last month, where finding the sweet spot, we talked about motivations, incentives, benefits, things that are those links, those connections that keep the partners in. But this photo is also a really nice illustration that centripetal force partly derives from partnership activity. It's that partnership activity that's going to keep the things in motion. So having given you these two concepts, critical mass and centripetal force, let's apply it specifically. And we can say that critical mass can pivot all the rest. So if you have a critical mass in your partnership, you'll be able to then bring in other partnering elements. So here are two different ways of thinking about it, two models. There's the version where the critical mass is in the supporting entity. So that might be your trustee, your secretariat, that institutional organizational support. And that is pivoting in the governing body and some other partnership elements, maybe creating a trust fund. But you can also have the reverse. And we see partnerships that are set up much more like this, that the governing body is where the critical mass is. So it's really critical mass of partners and participation, and they are pivoting in a supporting entity or a secretariat for trustee for the kinds of things that they're trying to do. So with these two models before you, some of you have been with me long enough that you can look at this and immediately see what I've been presenting, and that is my two modalities. So those of you who have either seen it in the book or heard me talk know that these are my two mighty oaks. And so in the typology chapter at the beginning of the primer, I lay these out. So we're in this forest, you've got this landscape, and you can see these two mighty oaks. And once you see these oaks, these two trees kind of canopied above everything else, then you can start to see the rest of the landscape. So basically, the first version, the critical mass of support in the supporting entity, is very much a one-stop shop, where it's a full service package. You have a full trustee, you have the custodial secretariat. That's definitely one very prevalent and powerful version of these partnership programs. But we also have the other, which is the international platform. And Henriette, who's with us, knows this very well. Basically what the UN MPTFO excels at is creating these partnership platforms where the governing body is a point of critical mass, and it is bringing in a more limited trustee function, maybe a more limited secretariat function. So here are the two oaks. Here's how critical mass and centripetal force relate in terms of the structural elements behind that. But I also just want to be very quick to say, you don't have to do one or the other, right? So you can have more than one critical point of mass. You can have critical mass in both. And then basically what you've got is this do-si-do for anyone who does square dancing, where you swing your partner, turn around. And that can also be very powerful and reinforcing. Now, critical mass comes up particularly in the early context of partnership programs. So you can take it from an establishment perspective, questions of like, do I have the critical mass to launch my partnership, or do we have the critical mass to take it to the next level? And for that, I'm going to pull from my 10 tried and true tips and refer to my number 8, which is be ready. So readiness is it's a somewhat slippery concept. It's a little hard to tell exactly when something is ready. But I think we can generally say that readiness is contextual, as is most everything in international partnership programs. And readiness is also a trade-off. So readiness is really balancing. It's essentially a judgment call between deciding whether you've done enough detail and enough diligence versus whether you're going to just close and get going. And that can be a hard judgment call. But I also want to point out that readiness is critical mass. And here it's really a question of stability, where partners ask themselves, what is it going to take to make the center hold? Are we there yet? And sustainability, you can think of the glue, but sustainability, what is it going to take to keep it going? Can we weather whatever is coming? And then, think about the ballast, think about the boat. In my primer for partners in this section on Be Ready, I just briefly mention a few things that you can watch for. So that's in the box here. If you see partners skirting issues early on or using vague language intentionally or unintentionally to mask the differences, staying so high level that they avoid the challenges or they don't even realize that they have challenges ahead. And then the one that we really see a lot is rushing ahead because there's some outside pressure. There's some big PR splash that they need for an international event, or they need a political win at a summit. And of course, always details for later. And later can be really difficult sometimes, depending on what those details are and whether it all hangs together. So let's put it this way. It's a bit of a formula. Readiness equals critical mass equals, and then you kind of have to fill in the blank on what is contextual and what's the right trade-off for what it would take to be a sustainable, efficient, and impactful partnership program. You can ask yourself questions like, do we have a critical mass of buy-in? That's kind of the perspective of the stakeholders. Do we have a critical mass of consensus, taking the perspective of the governing body, the decision makers? Is there enough common understanding, common ground that we can actually make consensus decisions and hold it together that way? Do we have a critical mass of commitment? And I'm not just referring to, say, legal commitments, binding commitments, but even soft commitments. Do we have enough assurance that we will get the resources, the time, the funding to be able to make this work? And that last one is really the one that we probably see the most, because of course, people really focus on the money. Do we have enough donor support? And here, of course, critical mass from a donor perspective, it doesn't have to be 10 donors. It can be one donor. It can be one champion donor. But you do want to know that you have a critical mass of the funding needed to accomplish what you're hoping to do. So I'm just going to close with one more slide. This is my partnering to go. And here I want to just take a quote from the book. So it's a short section on critical mass, but here's what I say there, and it will kind of sum up what I've been presenting. What constitutes critical mass is relative to what is proposed and projected. In this way, critical mass becomes a source of balance. If you have critical mass, whether in funding or buy-in or operational support, you can hoist your flag and then raise it over time. Or another image, critical mass gives you the ballast needed to keep the boat afloat, with room for more funds, partners, and activities to come on board, even after you have set sail. So that's it for the presentation part. Now it's time for the conversation. I can also just mention that we'll meet again in a month on January 12th, and we'll talk about a very related topic, the center of gravity. So we'll play out the physics a bit more. But for now, I would like to stop the share. All right. Thanks to everyone for listening, and I hope that stimulated a few thoughts on your end, whether you've even ever thought about critical mass or whether it has obsessed you, whether it's been elusive or you have tricks of the trade to tell us how to get there. Would love to hear any of your thoughts. So thank you, and the floor is open. I might have to point fingers, but I know who usually starts. So maybe I'll invite a comment from Nicola.
I was trying to be silent and see if anybody else.
No chance, no chance.
Actually, this has been great as always, and I have to say, love the artwork.
Thank you. Yours truly. I usually have a different illustrator, but this time I put pen to paper myself. So yeah, thank you.
Your illustrator did a great job.
I started with a bomb and then I went from there.
Okay. So I have been thinking of this in the context of the seaweed, the Safe Seaweed Coalition, which is a quite nascent partnership right now. And the thought that came to my mind was actually on your last but one slide. Do you have the critical mass in terms of these different elements? And there's another element, at least in this sphere, that seems like it's quite important, and that is expertise, knowledge. So there's a technical expertise and knowledge dimension to it. Perhaps not for all partnerships, but perhaps. I mean, as thinking back to the GAFSP, technical knowledge and expertise in agriculture and food security has so many different pieces to it. But then so does seaweed. So yep, I'm gonna suggest you consider adding technical knowledge and expertise.
It's so interesting. I like that. And I'm sure there are actually other things we could add to the list. So this was just to get us started. But I particularly like talking about expertise because it's almost assumed, right? We don't really pick it up as a topic. And it's partly assumed because partners coming to the table, at least in my experience, if they bring anything to the table other than maybe funds, they bring their expertise. And I'm going to put quotes around it.
Thank you. You might have been reading my face on that one.
Because I think they believe themselves to be sector experts in the sense that they are trying to achieve something and they've, got an agenda related to the topic. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't be convening. It's not to say that the representatives who are actually at the table, like constituting the governing body or doing the early negotiations, are the ones with the expertise, but there's almost an assumption that they have the expertise in their organization or are being driven by expertise to do something. But what's maybe more pertinent to your point is not just is the expertise there, but is the partnership structure and the way that the partners are coming together connecting to the relevant expertise. And is that expertise going to have space, the appropriate organizational structure, the appropriate partnership space to be brought to bear? And let me just go one step further and say, is that expertise that should be collectivized? In other words, should we be sharing our expertise and thinking about it in terms of, best practices or lessons learned, best practices going in, lessons learned coming out, reflecting on what the partnership is doing? And is there an appropriate feedback loop to let that become collectivized, right? So there's so many different ways we can play that out. And critical mass in that context might not only be, do we have the right expertise, but do we have ways to bring it to bear? And, to be honest, do we really have the expertise, or is it expertise in quotes? And we want to, make this a partnership that is more foundationally based on expertise, including evolving expertise. And I'm sure in your seaweed context, it's a really big question, not just for the ones who are convening this, but how you share that expertise with other partners you're trying to draw in. Because I, for one, don't know a whole lot about how seaweed impacts the food security environment. There's a lot, I think, for partners to learn. That's probably part of your resource mobilization strategy. Anyhow, I've spoken enough on that, so let me stop and invite more comments.
May I, Andrea?
Of course, Kareem, yes.
Well, it's nice to reconnect with you and all the colleagues. And I'm sorry I was running slightly late and didn't realize that I hadn't muted my microphone when I joined. Anyway, I really enjoyed, your presentation and the analogies that you've presented. It rings so true to me. I've gone through a few funds in my life, and I can see exactly, how this translates in reality. The one thing I wanted to perhaps highlight is, the partnerships are, how can I put this, a kind of dynamic process.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a time factor, so at the beginning everybody's all excited, and there is maybe a strong authorizing environment, a lot of political traction, and people have some visibility, etc. And things go on for a few years, and then perhaps after a while, that critical mass, it may no longer be there, and gradually people perhaps might start voting with their feet, and lose interest in what the partnership was trying to achieve. So I don't know if you or the colleagues have any thoughts and reflections on that. Thank you.
Oh, Kareem, thank you. And I always do have thoughts, so maybe I'll plunge in again, and then hopefully someone will follow as well. It's so true what you say, and the word I use a lot. I use dynamic a lot. I also use the word organic quite a lot. And in my books, I love pointing out the kind of organic, natural. We're people. There's a lot of dynamic and organic in all of that when we bring these partnerships together. Oops. I'm just realizing I'm going to lose you if I don't plug in here. Thank you. Okay. All right, there we go. Part of this is that partnerships are relationships, and relationships are life, and you can think about any relationship in your life, and I hope they're all going strong, but sometimes they don't keep the initial passion or the initial energy, and they need to continue to be revived. And so partnerships are very much the same way, that they need to be nurtured to stay fertile. And here's the point that I would add, though, to what you said, Kareem, which is why I do what I do, which is structure can really be your friend in this context. So that if you think about building some of these things into the structure and creating structures around the areas where you need the critical mass, you can start to, you don't want to make it rigid, you want to keep it flexible, but you could start to institutionalize or fortify the ways that your partnership will sustain over time. So think about that tether ball. You have the ball, your partner's floating all around, you have that center wherever your critical mass is. And what is that rope? What is that sinew? What are those connections? So like what we said last time, do you have the motivations? Have you built in the incentives? Are partners getting the benefits? And are you using structure to help you get there? So for example, let's go to the expertise point from Nicola. Let's keep it fresh, right? We want the expertise to constantly being evolving. Do we have a lessons learned function here? We don't need a whole body, but do we have a process by which we bring that in? We have a agenda item every year after our annual report to discuss lessons learned. Bingo, I just created something that is going to create a more dynamic piece that everyone's going to participate in, and maybe we'll keep interest and keep the relationship dynamic, making it, sustained off of the original critical mass. We can come up with a whole series of examples, but I would just point to structure, process, design, components as being a way to fortify that critical mass in this and build that centripetal force so it keeps doing that chain reaction. All right, I'm really deep in the physics here. Somebody save me.
Well, Andrea Noor had her hand up. And
Henriette has her hand up too, and I keep talking. So Andrea, go ahead.
I'll be super quick because I know
no, take your time.
So as Andrea knows, I'm pretty new to the partnerships world. I've been a generalist lawyer for a long time, but have had a bit of shock intro treatment to partnership programs recently. But those two models were interesting to me, the two models on critical mass, one on support and the other one on participation. I guess my question is, in the experience that those on the call have had, how often, and we're talking about evolution, how often do you find that a partnership program will fail to evolve? Maybe it started as one on the support model, maybe there's a view by one partner it needs to shift more to a participation model, or vice versa. And how often do these things they're not able to evolve and they just die away? How dynamic are these things really, I guess is my question. Thanks.
Yeah, I have thoughts for that too, but Henriette, why don't you weigh in, and maybe you have some comments on that, but also your original comment, please. Henriette, you're on mute.
Let me weigh in. So maybe just from a UN context. So, and I found it very interesting working with the World Bank with Andrea and seeing the World Bank like, fifths, you need 100 million and to set up a fund. The UN, 5 million and you can set up a fund. I mean, it's different organizations. And then if you try to combine those, you get different again. But it's also, for me, it's ultimately also a lot has to do this critical mass of making sure you have the right people on the table. And saying like, if I'm doing something, a partnership on this, and I can't get this organization or this partner involved, I'm just not credible. I shouldn't do this. If I can't convince the people who really need to be there, I can have the rest of the world, but the people who really need to be there on a partnership need to be there. I mean, Andrea, I'm thinking of coffee, when from our side, Central African Forest Initiative, from our side, we said, we need to have FAO on board. If you have the UN Organization on Forestry, if they don't buy the idea, we have a problem. Yeah, it's just, so it's also, it goes with that comment on the critical mass of expertise. Who are the brains you really need to be there to reach that level of ambition of where you want to be? So that, because there's so many other things you can do in life, then if you have that shot of setting up a new partnership, may it be successful. So to me, I wanted to say that was one of the amounts, but also I find it very important that you go through a process and you have to be ready to pull the plug. You may design, you may test something, and then ultimately say like, let's not set this up. We can't get the critical mass together of the people we need, the money, the buy-in, the consensus. Sometimes in the UN, probably also in the World Bank, it's two egos who can't get along. Okay, if you can't get it done, yeah, okay, don't do it. Or you set up something, and that's why I like the small, low threshold in the UN of 5 million. You set up something, and after 2 years, you say, it's not working. So learning also to build in your documents of saying like, if we don't get this much money, or if this and this doesn't happen within a certain period, we have the liberty to close this down. Because it should be just as easy to recognize, like, we thought we had a critical mass, we just get going. And at some point in time, you say like, some people are putting in so much effort and it's not going anywhere. Let them put the effort on something else which may succeed. If you see that like, yeah, you made a judgment call, well, your judgment was wrong, fine, lesson learned, let's try something else. So this is, but I agree very much on this critical mass, because ultimately you see it happening, you see it growing, and it's just lovely to see those cases when those forces reinforce and you say, oh yes, this one we got right.
Yeah, that's beautiful, right? Because when it happens, it can really be quite amazing and it can be really fortifying. I'd like to think that the CGIAR, with 40, 50 years of legacy now, has managed to do that over time. It's not easy, and it's been harder and harder the more legacy it has to be able to do that. But there's something to be said for a partnership that has lasted half a century. And, thinking about how many evolutions it has gone through to get to this point, but still somehow continually pulling out the critical mass to make the next iteration happen. But Henriette, one of the things you're doing is...
Yeah, because I wanted to add the example, for instance, in the UN Peace Building Fund, which set up like 12, 13 years ago. Every 3 years, they basically reinvent themselves. They look at the lesson, like if you deal with conflict and peace building, the world in 2021 doesn't look like the world in, I think it's 2006 when it got set up. So it's basically every time saying like, what have we learned? What needs to be added? Which countries are there? Where do we best spend our energy, and where do we use other? And that's also like you see one of those initiatives where you've got the critical mass, but you have to keep it going. It's never take it for granted. But you wanted to ask a question, Andrea.
No, I mean, it's mostly to react to what you're saying, because these are all such useful points. And one is to really focus in on part of what you're saying is how important flexibility is, which is a continuing theme here. We talk about stability and flexibility, but to be able to reinvent yourself, hopefully your structure as originally conceived allows you to do that reinvention and to be flexible over time. But the other thing that's really valuable about what you're putting forward, Henriette, is that you're exposing the life cycle nature of these partnership programs. And we're not just talking about critical mass at one point in time, but a critical mass over time. So clearly, there's a very important critical mass litmus test at the beginning. And again, you have to think contextually, what do I need the critical mass in? So Nicola's partnership really needs it in expertise, but probably also in funding and maybe a few more things. Different partnerships are going to have different thresholds and different needs in terms of where that critical mass lies, and it will change over time, and it's very appropriate to test it over time. So I like your idea, Henriette, from a life cycle perspective, that you start from the beginning saying, in 2 years, we will do that evaluation. And if we haven't met these markers or these milestones, we should really think twice about what we're doing. Or in 2 years, we're going to do an evaluation and just see where we are. You don't even have to be that structured about it. And it goes a little bit, Andrea, what you were talking about, this evolution and the question of failure to evolve. It's interesting in some ways how I would say the prevalent examples are that they do not die and drop off the vine, even though they probably should, right? So yes, they may fail to evolve, and then they kind of peter along. So I like Henriette's approach, where it's a little more deliberate, as opposed to, let's say particularly the supporting entity-centric partnerships tend to have a vested interest in the Secretariat for preserving we're talking about people again, preserving their positions, preserving their portfolios. And so those are sometimes, if you haven't built in those structural evaluation points, or have a little more discipline about checking yourself whether you still have your critical mass, some of these things will just continue beyond the prime, beyond their expiration date, natural expiration date. But I think even more telling is what Henriette is saying, that these questions really are very important at the beginning, and that it's not a failure to conclude that the partnership is not made to be, that the stars are not aligning, or that the time is not right, the partners aren't right. And it is expertise related, so there's certainly a technical piece there, but the stakeholder piece is also very political. And do you have the right players, FAO, not just because of the expertise, but also because of the politics of the environment? So Henriette, I think your hand was up first, and then Nicola, I'm not even sure, but please.
I think my hand was up first, and
Oh, sorry.
it's building on this point, inspired by Andrea's question. But first of all, and what you were just saying, some of those partnerships that maybe should be allowed to wither on the vine or snipped. Just a little quote from Mahmoud Mohiuddin when he came to deliver a message of support for us at one point. This was in GAFSP. He referred to them as zombies that really needed to be dealt with. So he was encouraging international partners not to be supporting these zombies. And I thought that was a pretty good image. But it does, I'm kind of grappling with the physics on this, with, you know, the story, Andrea, but just for the folks here, where we had strong support from the bank and strong support from the governing body. But when the bank began to do its own fundraising at the same time as our partnership needed to engage in fundraising, the bank, which was the housing entity, said, oh, no, you don't do your fundraising now. And that led to, instead of your ball going really nicely around with the centripetal forces balanced very well, there was a lot of shaking happening. So I'm not quite sure what the physics is, but I think that there's some kind of a change in your image. I think there's some kind of a change to the supporting entity that changes the forces. And that's like a dynamic picture that could be worth looking at. Because I suspect we weren't the only ones affected by it. But
particularly from the perspective that the supporting entity may not even fully realize what it's doing. You know, it has a ripple effect that goes beyond what the supporting entity might intend or might, you know, be aware of. But of course, the partners are feeling it pretty strongly. The partnership is feeling it pretty strongly. Yes, Henriette.
Maybe there was not a comment which I wasn't say, but it's maybe just to know for people, I took early retirement from the UN, so I'm no longer there, but it's also, I'm looking to the damage to partnerships that you can do in those processes. And you remember the concessional financing facility, like ultimately also, I've been on the negotiation side from UN, negotiating with 8 people from the World Bank and still try, come on, you need to listen. We are partners in this process. And it's, because for me, it's also that it's a critical mass. You need also the next step that you need in a year and in 3 years. I mean, even if you pull the plug, you should have a network and you should leave behind friends, because you've tried something together, it didn't work, but you should be able to call these people next time around. That's why I'm in this call. Yeah, next time around when something is happening. And the other way, you can have something which looks successful, but where, yeah. So, but it's basically precisely where it looks successful to the outside, but you have internal enemies, because people say, like, you didn't treat me, you didn't follow the golden rule, do unto others as you want others to do unto you. And it's bad, because next time around, when you have a bigger global problem and you need those people together on an issue, people may not pick up the phone. So you're undermining the critical mass for your next initiative, so to speak. So you're not sustainable in the way you deal with the global issues. Am I rambling too much?
Not at all. I think you have just moved from the life cycle perspective of a partnership within the partnership to the fungal version of the worldwide network perspective, or maybe the seaweed version of the worldwide network perspective of what it means to be part of the international community, and essentially partnering over and over and over again with each other in overlapping contexts, in iterative contexts. And maybe that's why we also show up for programs like this, because we realize that when I think about it, 3 of us on the call, Kareem, Henriette, and myself, were very intimately involved representing the 3 founding partners of the GCFF. And I think had a great experience pulling that together. And maybe some of your comments bear on the GCFF, maybe on something else, Henriette, but there was a lot of early passion and engagement, Kareem, to your point, and let's see where it is today and how that might have helped build for other engagements or not. If what's the flavor, that's the taste that's being left in everyone's mouth, because there will be other partnerships or other endeavors where we need to keep interacting with each other. And that's particularly true of the supporting organizations that have partnerships as their business line. It's not just a one-off, but that are open for business in these contexts and also need to think about it as a going concern, not just for the partnership, but for themselves as a business organization. So Kareem, you may have some perspective on that coming from the Islamic Development Bank, and how that partnership dynamic evolves within the broader international community, where you find yourselves, or where you would like to find yourself.
Well, as you rightly pointed out, Andrea, and the colleagues also mentioned that at the beginning, obviously, there's a lot of enthusiasm, there's a lot of energy. But then as time goes by, the partnership can morph into something else, something perhaps even greater, or just fade away in the horizon. The one thing, to be honest, that I'd like to mention, and personnel changes, be they at the working level, but equally, and perhaps more importantly, at the leadership level. I mean, you mentioned the GCFF. I mean, we all know, what prompted the GCFF, and we're 5 years later or 6 years later now, the situation is little different, and the World Bank has a different leadership. We have a different leadership, and I guess the UN as well. So, these things do, in the end, rub off on those partnerships, and whether the same level of support is still there, at the highest level. This is what I've seen and experienced, time and time again. Thank you.
Yeah, it's clearly not a given. I guess it's
Andrea, can I just add one line to that? Because I do think it's Karim, I have fantastic memories of going to the headquarters of the Islamic Development Bank. So I never would have come there hadn't been for the CFF negotiations. But it's not just at the top. I think like you have 3, 4, 5 levels deep. You need to get the lawyers on board. You need to have there's so many different people. And in a way, the more critical mass, because it's not just business, it's also people say, oh, I like to work with that person. Yeah. So it's also the top leadership, the people under there, the program manager, the lawyers, everywhere you have built that network, and the more layers you find that you have, Nicola, you talked about the technical expertise, the more layers you find those connections, the easier it is to deal with change in leadership.
Yeah, actually, I think that makes a lot of sense, and that resonates with my own experience. Yeah, very much so. It's not that one can substitute for the other. I think it's important to have all those in place, but that there is definitely a layering effect that can be very, very useful that way. I'm also struck by the idea, one thing that we often said within the context of the World Bank was to talk about being a good partner. Like, what does it take to be a good partner? So a good global citizen within the international community, but also a good partner within the partnerships that you open yourselves up to or agree to support. And here we are again, because the theme of this series is balance, is the need to balance the internal with the external, that, you know, there will always, as a supporting entity, be a critical mass within the institution. That is, you know, by definition, because that's the operating environment that you're leaning on to be able to make this partnership work. But it's to recognize that there's also this other critical mass in the partnership itself. So we're back to that do-si-do. It's not enough to say, I'm a supporting entity and I'm going to pivot everything in and everyone's going to do what I say. You know, it's not just my way or the highway when you're in a partnership. By the same token, the partners have to have a similar dynamic. They can't tell the supporting entity exactly what to do. There has to be that balance. But if the supporting entity can see the partners as, or make sure that the partnership perspective is part of decisions that they're making internally, so they're thinking internally and externally, then hopefully you're setting the stage for these kind of longer term connections and fortifying the ability to create more of these pivoting environments, whether it's in that same partnership or vis-a-vis other partnerships in the future, so that that balance happens at the individual level, like you've been saying, reinforcing among staff, but it also happens at the institutional and partnership level, that you're setting yourselves up as institutions to think internally and externally and be a good partner institutionally vis-a-vis the role that you're playing, or that you're the comparative advantage that you're able to play. I know we've gone pretty long past the half hour, and we often go to the hour, so I'm really happy to continue. But I feel like we've definitely gone from, you know, a glue, a container, and a boat to the life cycle, to the larger, you know, international community network. So I think we've really, I think of this also, if you think about centripetal force and critical mass, of course, we're talking about the universe and the celestial bodies. So we could go as wide as you want, you know, the sun and the earth and the moon and all our pulls on each other. They're all kind of, it's this relationship that we want to be mindful of when we're thinking of balance in the partnership context. And I think we will see this played out, I hope in January, to play this out even further when we talk about center of gravity and really talk about what are the elements that create that gravity, that mass, that pull. Again, I'm mangling the physics of it, but what are the specific techniques and mechanisms that you can use to make sure that you have balance at the beginning, throughout, and even a balanced wind down, that when it's time to close, you're in a balanced position to be able to do that and maintain good relations for the next one, as we've been saying. So any closing thoughts before we perhaps close for the day? Kareem, I'm looking forward to the time when we all get to visit each other again. So hopefully that won't be too far in the distant future. At least we can do it virtually for now. And so I wish you all very happy holidays, and we'll meet again, hopefully at the other side of the into the new year. So wishing everyone happiness, health, and a good start to the new year. As we say in German, guten Rutsch, and then we'll see you in January. Thank you.
Happy
Thank you
holidays.
very much. Have a good
Thanks.
holiday.
All right.
Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everyone.